He stood tall, sang even taller, and had a voice so rich it seemed to echo from the hills of West Virginia themselves. Hawkshaw Hawkins was more than a country singer. He was a presence, a towering figure in the golden age of country music. With his deep baritone and cowboy charm, he won hearts across America. But behind the songs and stage lights, something darker was always brewing. In 1963, Hawkins died in the same plane crash that claimed Patsy, Cline, and Cowboy Copas. A tragedy the world accepted at face value. But what if we told you the crash wasn't just a sad accident? What if there were signs it didn't have to happen at all? Over the years, strange clues have emerged. Legal disputes, missing documents, and whispers of a cover-up buried by Nashville insiders. And now, new revelations have come to light. The mystery behind Hawkshaw Hawkins's final flight has finally been solved. And what's been uncovered will change how you remember country music history. Hawkshaw Hawkins, born Harold Franklin Hawkins in 1921, was never meant to fade into the background. Towering at 6 feet 5 inches with a voice to match, he stood out from the very first time he stepped onto a stage. Raised in rural West Virginia during the Depression, he came from humble beginnings, working on farms, shining shoes, and singing in church halls before he ever picked up a microphone professionally. His early years were defined by hard work and perseverance, and he soon turned that grit into a rising country music career. By the late 1940s, he was a known name on the barn dance circuit, and by the 1950s, he was a regular on the Grand Ole Opry. Songs like Lonesome 7 to 7203 and Slowpoke weren't just hits. They were staples of American homes, playing on jukeboxes, radios, and record players in every state. But behind the glowing stage lights and roaring applause, Hawkshaw was juggling more than a microphone. His marriage to fellow Opry star Jean Shepard, though often painted as idyllic, had cracks that were rarely discussed publicly. They had children, a beautiful home, and fans who adored them. But the truth whispered by those close to the couple was that Hawkshaw was feeling intense pressure. Personally, financially, and professionally. The demands of the road, rising competition in the industry, and looming contractual disputes with his label had begun to wear on him. And then there was the dark cloud hanging over every traveling musician in that era. Plane travel. Hawkshaw had always been wary of flying. In fact, close friends would later reveal that he often voiced discomfort about hopping on small aircraft. But the pressure to perform, especially for benefit concerts and tightly scheduled Opry appearances, left little room for hesitation. It's what made that March 5, 1963, flight so haunting. Hawkins, along with Patsy Cline and Cowboy Copas, boarded a Piper Comanche piloted by Cline's manager, Randy Hughes. The weather was poor, the flight plan rushed, and the pilot, while experienced, wasn't licensed to fly solely by instruments. Despite these red flags, they took off into stormy skies. Within an hour, the plane vanished from radar. News broke the following morning. All 4 passengers were dead. It was immediately ruled a tragic accident, a weather-related crash caused by pilot error. The country music world mourned, fans wept, and tributes poured in. But almost no one asked why 3 of Nashville's biggest stars were packed into a small, under-equipped plane flying through dangerous weather. No one publicly questioned the Opry's scheduling demands or why Hawkins, who reportedly didn't want to be on that flight, boarded it anyway. Years later, new details would emerge. Letters Hawkshaw wrote to friends expressing fear about upcoming travel, insurance documents with confusing clauses, and even claims from industry insiders suggesting that one of the passengers had received threats prior to the trip. For decades, these signs were buried beneath nostalgia and grief. But now, with fresh eyes and long-hidden records finally coming to light, the truth about what led to Hawkshaw Hawkins's death is beginning to take shape. And it isn't good. The crash that took Hawkshaw Hawkins's life was immediately labeled a tragic accident. But not everyone bought the official story. From the start, questions swirled. The weather had been awful that day. Storm clouds, high winds, low visibility, and yet the plane took off anyway. Why? According to FAA records, Randy Hughes, the pilot and Patsy Cline's manager, was not certified to fly solely by instruments, meaning he legally shouldn't have been flying in those conditions at all. That fact alone should have grounded the flight, but it didn't. So what pushed them to go up? Behind the scenes, there was pressure. All three stars, Patsy, Hawkshaw, and Cowboy Copas, were trying to squeeze in benefit concerts, Grand Ole Opry appearances, and recording sessions. Hawkins, in particular, had been working tirelessly to secure his spot in the changing world of country music. Nashville was shifting. Rockabilly had shaken things up, and younger stars were flooding the scene. Hawkshaw's more traditional style wasn't getting the same radio play it once had. Privately, he'd shared with friends that he was feeling sidelined, even used. At the same time, financial troubles were mounting. Hawkins had invested heavily in property, some of which had not performed well. There were whispers that he was being mismanaged, bad contracts, missed royalty payments, even talk of money being funneled without his knowledge. He was reportedly preparing to cut ties with his longtime label and restructure his business affairs. Some say that made him enemies, powerful ones. And then there was his personal life. His marriage to Jean Shepard, though often portrayed as loving, had recently hit rocky ground. According to friends, Hawkshaw was worried about providing for his growing family and making sure his wife and children would be secure no matter what. The pressure was weighing on him. One letter, believed to have been written just weeks before the crash, included a line that raised eyebrows. "I've got a bad feeling about March. I don't know why, but something just feels off." After the crash, things got even more confusing. Hawkins's insurance payout was unusually delayed. When it did arrive, discrepancies were found in the paperwork, different signatures, altered dates, and a suspicious reassignment of beneficiaries that occurred just days before the accident. The official reason? Clerical error. But people who knew him insisted he would have never changed those documents without telling Jean. In the years that followed, Jean Shepard kept quiet about many of these oddities. She focused on raising their children and continuing her own career. But even she hinted at her doubts during private interviews, once saying, "There were things about that flight that never sat right with me. Things I never could explain." Now, decades later, documents have surfaced that suggest Hawkshaw may have been preparing to blow the whistle on some behind-the-scenes practices in Nashville. Financial records unearthed from a former manager's storage unit show misallocated funds and erased accounting trails tied to Hawkins's royalties. Combine that with his last-minute decision to board a plane he didn't trust, and you begin to see the outline of a mystery long ignored. This wasn't just a tragic accident in the sky. It might have been something far more calculated. And what's been uncovered will change how you remember country music history. The investigation into the crash that killed Hawkshaw Hawkins, Patsy Cline, and Cowboy Copas was wrapped up quickly. Too quickly for some. The Civil Aeronautics Board, CAB, released its findings. Pilot error due to poor weather and lack of instrument certification. Case closed. But the deeper you look, the more you realize that key elements were overlooked or intentionally ignored. For instance, there was no black box on board, which wasn't uncommon for private aircraft at the time. But the pilot, Randy Hughes, had reportedly raised concerns just days before the flight about the plane's maintenance. One mechanic, who later spoke anonymously, claimed Hughes had asked for work on the altimeter, a crucial instrument in low visibility conditions, but that the request was denied due to time constraints and budget. No official record of that complaint was ever added to the investigation. Then there's the curious matter of the flight plan or lack thereof. Hughes never filed a formal plan, which made it difficult to reconstruct the intended route. The crash site, located near Camden, Tennessee, suggested the plane had veered off course. Whether that was due to weather, disorientation, or something more sinister, we may never know. But one chilling detail stood out. The cockpit radio had been tuned to a frequency far from what would have helped them navigate through the storm. It was almost as if Hughes, or someone else, had been deliberately avoiding communication. As rumors mounted, so did the number of people who wanted to keep things quiet. Country music was booming, and the deaths of 3 major stars brought waves of media attention. The Grand Ole Opry, record labels, and managers all scrambled to shape the narrative. The message was simple: mourn, but don't ask questions. And yet, questions kept coming. Why were no toxicology reports ever publicly released for Randy Hughes? Was he stressed, under the influence, or simply pressured beyond his capabilities? Why was there no deep dive into whether the plane itself was airworthy? And why did multiple eyewitnesses, local residents near Camden, report hearing a strange fluttering sound from the plane moments before impact, as if something had broken loose midair? Some of the most damning pieces of the puzzle came from a source no one expected. A retired FAA clerk who, decades later, revealed he had seen a memo suggesting the plane might have been overloaded beyond its safe limit. They were carrying too much, he claimed. Gear, instruments, and 3 full-grown adults. Plus, the plane wasn't built for that kind of turbulence. If true, that would mean the flight never should have taken off in the first place. But records of that memo are gone, missing from the FAA archives. Behind the scenes, Hawkshaw Hawkins had reportedly been documenting everything. Payments he was owed, shady deals he didn't approve, and a list of names he planned to confront. Friends say he carried a small notebook with him everywhere, one that's never been recovered. Jean Shepard later hinted it may have gone missing in the confusion following the crash. As for the financial aftermath, it raised more red flags. Hawkins's life insurance claim took nearly 2 years to fully pay out, far longer than average. When it did, a chunk of the money reportedly disappeared, transferred to a third-party business account linked to someone with deep ties to Nashville's old guard. Again, no formal investigation. What seemed like a freak accident starts to look, in hindsight, like a tragedy that could have been prevented, or perhaps even orchestrated. The next part of the story may expose the powerful names Hawkshaw was threatening to cut ties with, and why his silence was worth more than his survival. Despite the tragedy of Hawkshaw Hawkins's untimely death, the questions surrounding his final days have only grown louder with time. And part of that is due to what happened in the immediate aftermath. When investigators arrived at the crash site outside Camden, Tennessee, they found a chaotic scene. Scattered among the wreckage were personal belongings, mangled instruments, and fragments of the aircraft's fuselage. But one thing was oddly absent: Hawkshaw's leather-bound notebook. That notebook, according to his wife, Jean Shepard, and a few close friends, was something he rarely let out of his sight. It was more than a journal, it was his ledger. It contained records of gigs, outstanding payments, disputes with booking agents, and even names of individuals Hawkins suspected of stealing from him. One entry, Shepard once said in an interview, was underlined in red and read, "Watch Branson. He's not who he says he is." The identity of Branson was never publicly revealed, and Jean never elaborated. But after Hawkshaw's death, so did any trace of that notebook. It was never logged in the investigation, never turned over to family, and never seen again. Meanwhile, the financial chaos that followed didn't help settle suspicions. At the time of his death, Hawkshaw was on the brink of transitioning from a touring performer to something larger, a full media brand. He had reportedly signed a deal with a management agency that had close connections to Nashville's elite. But after his death, that deal disappeared. The agency claimed the contract was never finalized, but Shepard insisted she saw Hawkshaw sign it just days before the crash. The supposed copy of the signed contract? Gone. When she pushed for answers, lawyers told her it had likely been misplaced in the confusion after the plane crash. The royalties situation didn't make sense either. Hawkshaw had multiple songs on the charts, and his popularity surged posthumously. But when Jean Shepard asked for financial statements from the publishing company, the numbers didn't add up. In fact, revenue from Lonesome's 7-7203, his biggest hit, had seemingly stalled just weeks after the crash. Yet radio play and jukebox requests were at an all-time high. Where was that money going? And who was rerouting it? Then came the most bizarre piece of the puzzle. A man named Darrell Long, a former studio assistant who worked in Nashville in the early 1960s, came forward decades later with a shocking confession. He claimed that 2 days before the crash, he had overheard a heated phone call between Hawkins and an unnamed label executive. Hawkshaw was threatening to go public if he didn't start receiving his full royalties. "I've got names," Darrell said. Hawkins shouted, "and I'll take them down with me if I have to." After the crash, Darrell never mentioned the conversation. Fear, he said, kept him quiet. "You didn't go up against those people. You just didn't." And when he tried to approach the label's management anonymously with questions, he received a single typed letter in the mail: "Let the dead rest." By now, the picture forming isn't just one of tragedy. It's of silence, of missing documents, of whispered threats. Hawkshaw Hawkins may have died in a plane crash, but it's clear the forces around him, financial, legal, and maybe even criminal, were far more dangerous than any storm. The deeper you dig, the more it looks like someone wanted him gone. And we may now be closer than ever to knowing exactly who that someone was. In the days following Hawkshaw Hawkins's death, the country music world was in mourning. But behind closed doors, there was tension. Jean Shepard, Hawkins's wife and a rising star in her own right, quickly found herself thrust into a legal and emotional battle she hadn't anticipated. While pregnant with their second child, she was expected to grieve, protect her family, and sort through the mess Hawkshaw's death left behind. What she didn't expect was resistance at every turn. Within 2 weeks of the crash, Jean reported to close friends that Hawkshaw's assets, particularly income from his final tour and upcoming record sales, were being stonewalled by his management. She claimed she was denied access to accounts she should have legally inherited, told by lawyers that things weren't finalized, and that ownership was disputed. How? They were married with shared assets. But suddenly, Hawkshaw's financial affairs were being treated like a puzzle, and Jean wasn't given the final pieces. Even more baffling were the missing property deeds. Hawkins had reportedly bought a house just outside Nashville, a place where he and Jean could raise their children and finally settle down. But when Jean went to retrieve the deed, the records were mysteriously gone. County records showed that the home had been transferred on paper to a holding company just 48 hours before Hawkshaw boarded that doomed flight. The timing raised eyebrows. Why would he suddenly shift ownership of his dream home? And more importantly, who controlled that holding company? Jean tried to push back. She hired her own lawyer, demanded a forensic audit of Hawkshaw's estate, and began writing letters to industry insiders. Some responded with sympathy. Others went silent. The more she pushed, the more resistance she faced. At one point, a longtime Nashville promoter told her over the phone, "Jean, you're stirring something best left buried. Hawk was a good man. Let him rest." It sounded more like a threat than a warning. And then came the rumors, ugly, personal ones meant to discredit her. Whispers began circulating in certain circles that Jean had pressured Hawkshaw too much, that she was too ambitious. Even that she may have known more about the crash than she let on. It was a classic playbook move. Turn suspicion away from those in power by aiming it at the grieving widow. The psychological toll on Jean was immense. She gave birth to their second son in the midst of lawsuits, closed doors, and grief that was never allowed to heal. She later said in an interview, "I was being erased. Everything Hawkshaw left behind was being erased. They wanted to scrub him out and move on like he never happened." But she didn't back down. Jean kept records, journals, even tape recordings of some of her phone calls during those months. And decades later, some of that material would become crucial in connecting the dots. She knew there was more to her husband's death than a plane crash. She just didn't have the power to prove it. Not yet. As investigators and journalists now reopen the mystery surrounding Hawkshaw Hawkins's final days, it's Jean's persistence, her refusal to let the memory of her husband be buried, that may ultimately crack this case wide open. The next chapter of this story leads us into the shadowy world of Nashville's power brokers and a deal gone terribly wrong. As whispers turned into quiet confessions behind closed doors, a new theory began gaining traction. One that Jean Shepard had suspected all along but had never dared speak out loud. Hawkshaw Hawkins wasn't just the victim of a tragic plane crash. He may have been the victim of a setup. And the motive? Power, control, and money. In early 1963, Hawkins had made a bold decision behind the scenes. He was preparing to leave his longtime management and booking agency, one of the most powerful in Nashville at the time, to launch his own independent label and touring operation. It was a risky move. Artists who went independent in those days often found themselves blackballed from venues, radio stations, and television appearances. But Hawkins had grown tired of being underpaid, underpromoted, and creatively stifled. And more importantly, he wanted to control his future for his family's sake. According to a confidential letter later uncovered in Jean's personal archives, Hawkins had already drafted a termination notice to his management and was seeking legal advice on how to retrieve master recordings he believed were being withheld. One handwritten note scrawled in his planner read, "End of March, done with them. No turning back." But he never made it to April. Here's where things get even stranger. Just days before the crash, Hawkins had reportedly met with an anonymous investor who promised to fund his new venture. That man's name has never been publicly revealed. But according to a private investigator hired by Jean in the 1980s, the man vanished completely after the crash. His office was emptied, phone disconnected, and all records disappeared. At the same time, new contracts appeared, backdated to suggest Hawkins had extended agreements with his former agency. The ink on these documents was suspiciously fresh. Jean suspected forgery, but when she brought it up to attorneys, she was told to let it go, for your own safety. That phrase would haunt her for years. Then came the haunting visit. A friend of Hawkshaw's from the Opry days, someone he trusted, came to Jean's home late one night and quietly handed her a brown envelope. Inside were photos of Hawkins with several men at a private industry party weeks before his death. One of the men had known ties to organized crime.